There are so many myths out there about supervolcanoes, and some of them are just plain weird. So we're gonna put some of them to rest right now. This is Supervolcano Myths Busted. Hi, it's me, and welcome to this channel where we learn about cool stuff related to volcanoes and other cool stuff like that. Yellowstone National Park contains the largest active volcanic system in the United States and one of the largest in the world. This means that many people wonder about the possibility of a future eruption, especially given the park's history of major eruptions in the past. As a result, there are a lot of myths surrounding the volcano. Some of them are just plain weird, while others are potentially harmful. Today, we're gonna set the record straight on some of the most popular ones. Let's jump into it. We'll start with a myth that doesn't really have a name, but I'm going to call it the silent eruption myth. It goes something like this. Yellowstone has been really quiet lately and hasn't erupted in more than 700 years. It's due for an eruption, and a big one. First off, let's talk about the last eruption of the Yellowstone Supervolcano. In the United States, scientists use the term supervolcano to refer to any volcano that has had an eruption magnitude of 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VEI. This index describes the relative violence of an eruption based on several factors such as the volume of material ejected, the height of the eruption plume, and the area covered by the eruption. The largest known eruption at Yellowstone was 640,000 years ago with a VEI of 8. But Yellowstone has had 3 other eruptions with a VEI of 8. The second largest was 1.3 million years ago, followed by eruptions to 0.1 and to 0.9 million years ago. All 4 eruptions form the massive magma chamber that lies beneath Yellowstone today, which contains the largest known active magma chamber in the world. And those eruptions also created the massive calderas that are visible today as the Greater, Middle, and Silver Creek caldera. And no, not all of Yellowstone is under the park today. The town of West Yellowstone, Montana sits right on the southern rim of the Greater Caldera. If you look at these older eruptions on a map, they all happen in roughly the same place, which is why we know that the next eruption will probably happen here too. But they don't necessarily happen in the same place each time. For example, Mount St. Helens in Washington state has had multiple eruptions over the years, but they haven't all come from the same place. In fact, its most recent eruption came from a site about 20 miles away from where it previously erupted. Anyway, back to Yellowstone. You may be wondering what makes an eruption an eruption. And I get that because sometimes the word eruption is used differently by different people. So let me spell it out. An eruption happens when magma reaches the surface of the earth. If the magma doesn't reach the surface, we call it magma. But if it does reach the surface, we call it lava. And if the magma chamber underground gets lower during an eruption, then we call that a caldera forming event. That's because when the pressure holding up the roof of the magma chamber is released, the roof collapses. But back to the myth. Some people think that because Yellowstone hasn't erupted in more than 700 years, it must be due for an eruption soon. They might say, well, it erupted in 1300 CE, so it should erupt again in 700 years. Well, here's the problem with that logic. Eruptions don't work that way. It's not like clockwork where we can predict when the next eruption will occur by looking at when the last one occurred. Volcanoes don't keep regular hours, so to speak. We can't know when the next eruption will occur simply by knowing when the last one occurred. Instead, we take into account multiple factors when making eruption forecasts. These include seismic activity, ground deformation, and changes in gas emissions. But most importantly, we analyze data from past eruptions to build models of how the volcano behaves. In the case of Yellowstone, scientists can look at the frequency of past eruptions and use that information to forecast future eruptions. However, there's a problem with this method too, because Yellowstone hasn't behaved regularly in the past either. Scientists have found that the average time between eruptions at Yellowstone is about 600,000 years. But the time between the most recent eruption and the previous one was only 130,000 years. This means that it could be thousands or hundreds of thousands of years until the next eruption. We don't know which way it will go. The point is, there is no set schedule for when the next eruption will occur. So we can't assume that it will happen soon just because it hasn't erupted in 700 years. No, 2 is the earthquake myth. Some people claim that earthquakes predict volcanic eruptions and that a large earthquake will strike before Yellowstone erupts. While there are certainly correlations between seismic activity and volcanic activity, it's not accurate to say that an earthquake predicts an upcoming eruption. There are 2 reasons why. The first reason is that seismic activity at Yellowstone varies naturally. Most of the seismic activity at Yellowstone is caused by tectonic plate movement. Like most of the rest of the western United States, Yellowstone sits on the boundary between the North American plate and the Pacific plate. Because of this, there is constant seismic activity in the region. This is why there are so many earthquakes in California. The same thing happens at Yellowstone, except because the plates aren't moving quite as quickly here, the earthquakes tend to be smaller. About 1,000 earthquakes happen in the region every year. Now, that sounds like a lot, but most of these earthquakes are very small and cannot be felt. In fact, most are less than a magnitude 3. So why do people think that earthquakes predict eruptions? Well, that's our second reason. Sometimes seismic activity increases before an eruption. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, it's pretty easy to notice. For example, before the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, seismic activity increased dramatically. Likewise, before the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, seismic activity increased even more. Yellowstone is no exception. In 1859, there were about 1,000 earthquakes in the region. Then, in 1860, there were nearly 3,000 earthquakes. The following year, there were more than 3,500 earthquakes. Then, everything went back to normal. However, another swarm of earthquakes hit in 1985 and 1986 with 3,000 earthquakes per year. Then things settled down again. A swarm of earthquakes also occurred in 1995 and 1996, although it wasn't quite as intense as the previous ones. And another one occurred in 2009. If you look at the data closely, you can see that there is a pattern to these swarms. They seem to occur roughly every 30 years. So far, the current swarm of earthquakes began in 2018, but it isn't quite big enough yet to cause concern. So, to answer the question, yes, seismic activity can precede an eruption at Yellowstone, but it doesn't necessarily mean that an eruption is imminent. No, 3 is the Yellowstone super-eruption myth. This myth goes something like this. If Yellowstone were to erupt, it would be catastrophic and destroy the entire United States. This couldn't be further from the truth. Of course, it's true that Yellowstone could be catastrophically dangerous if it were to erupt today. According to a USGS report, an eruption of the same size as the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption would produce ash that blankets much of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, and travel to Oregon and Nevada. But what about a larger eruption? Here's where we need to clarify terminology. Scientists use the term supervolcano to describe any volcano that has had an eruption magnitude of 8 on the VEI. This is equivalent to an 8 on the Richter scale for earthquakes. Just like earthquakes, this is a logarithmic scale. This means that each whole number represents a tenfold increase in severity. This is important to remember because the difference between a V7 and V8 eruption is monumental. It is 30 times more powerful. To put this into perspective, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens was a V5, but the largest eruption at Yellowstone is a V8. This means that the largest eruption at Yellowstone was 30 times more powerful than the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. So how bad would it be? According to the USGS, an eruption of this size would cover much of the northern United States in ash and send ash as far away as Florida and the eastern coast of Greenland. However, that doesn't mean that the whole country would be destroyed. Ash falls heaviest near the volcano and decreases in intensity the farther away you get. Most of the ash in the eastern United States would be less than 6 inches deep and wouldn't completely bury anything. In fact, according to some reports, the ash from the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which was a V7, reached all the way to the Americas and Europe. But this didn't destroy the world either. Yeah, it was bad, but not world-ending. A V8 eruption at Yellowstone would undoubtedly be devastating to much of the United States and would likely affect the whole country. But it wouldn't end the world. I hope you enjoyed learning about some of the biggest myths out there about supervolcanoes. Do you know any others? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll make sure to address them in the next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.